Daniel's ship landed with a low hum, dust rising around him as he stepped out. The air was heavy, filled with the smell of wet soil and strange flowers that glowed faintly even in daylight. He checked his scanner for minerals, but something felt off. The valley below was too quiet. No birds, no big animals, just the sound of wind brushing against tall grass. He walked carefully, his boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. His eyes caught movement near the rocks, act like tiny shadows running fast. He thought maybe they were insects, but then he noticed shapes, small figures with arms, legs, and even clothes made of leaves and threads. They were alive, not bugs, but tiny people. They were no taller than his hand, their skin glowing faintly like fireflies in the dark. Daniel froze, staring. The tiny aliens scattered quickly, hiding behind stones, leaves, and roots of trees. Some peeked out with wide, glowing eyes, trembling, as if they had seen a monster. Daniel crouched down slowly, raising his hand in peace, whispering, "It's okay. I won't hurt you." But they didn't move closer. He sighed and sat on a rock, trying not to scare them. For a moment, he thought maybe they would come out, maybe they would trust him, but then the air filled with a different sound, a clicking, sharp and hungry. From the far side of the valley, creatures crawled out of holes in the ground. They were much bigger, insect-like predators with long legs, black shells, and jaws that snapped together loudly. Their eyes glowed red, and they moved in groups. Daniel realized what was happening. The tiny aliens were not hiding from him. They were hiding from these monsters. He saw them run in panic, parents grabbing children, rushing toward their small stone houses. The predators stomped closer, crushing little fences and leaf bridges under their sharp feet. Daniel stood, his heart racing. He told himself it wasn't his problem. He was here for minerals, not to fight someone else's war. But then his eyes caught something. A single tiny figure stood in the open, shaking but refusing to move. It was a small alien girl, no bigger than a doll, with bright eyes and threads of silver in her hair. She stood in front of the children, arms stretched wide as if to protect them with her tiny body. The predators loomed over her, their shadows covering her completely. Daniel clenched his fists. He could not look away. He grabbed the nearest thing he could find, a heavy branch lying near the ground. It wasn't much compared to the monster's sharp legs and jaws, but it was better than nothing. He stepped forward, his boots shaking the ground. The tiny aliens gasped, their glowing eyes following his every move. Some cried out in fear, thinking the giant man was about to crush them as well. But Daniel didn't stop. His heart pounded harder as he reached the girl and swung the branch with all his strength. The sound of wood cracking against hard shell echoed through the valley. One predator flew back, rolling across the ground. The others hissed and turned toward him, their red eyes fixed on the strange, tall being who dared to interfere. Daniel held the branch tightly, sweat already dripping from his face. He was taller, stronger, but there were many of them, and they were fast. One rushed at him, snapping its jaws near his leg. He kicked, sending it tumbling. Another leapt, claws scratching his arm, but he smashed it down with the branch. The tiny aliens huddled together, staring in disbelief. Their small world had never seen anything like this, a giant from the sky fighting for them. Daniel grunted, swinging again and again, forcing the predators back. But for every one he hit, two more came forward. His muscles burned, his breath grew heavy, yet he refused to step back. He saw the girl still standing, her small hands covering her mouth, tears in her glowing eyes. That alone gave him strength to keep going. Finally, after what felt like endless minutes, the predators gave a sharp hiss and retreated. They crawled back into the shadows, leaving behind broken shells and deep scratches in the ground. Silence filled the valley again, broken only by Daniel's heavy breathing. He dropped the branch, his arm trembling, and looked down. The tiny girl had not moved. Slowly, she lowered her hands and stared up at him with wonder. Behind her, more tiny aliens came out from hiding, their glowing eyes wide and filled with confusion. A small group stepped forward, carrying spears no bigger than toothpicks. They looked at Daniel with both fear and respect. One of them, older with a crown of crystal leaves, bowed deeply. His voice was high-pitched but steady, as he spoke words Daniel couldn't understand. Still, the meaning was clear. The chief was thanking him. The little people fell to their knees, whispering to each other. To them, this man was not just a stranger. He was a protector who had arrived when no one else did. Daniel stood there, breathing hard, staring at them. He didn't know what he had just gotten himself into. He came for minerals, for work, not for responsibility. Yet the way they looked at him, like he was a hero, sent a strange feeling through his chest. These tiny lives had trusted him without words, and he had stepped into their fight without thinking. Now, as the chief gestured for him to follow, Daniel wondered what kind of world he had stumbled into and what price he might have to pay for being their defender. The silence in the valley did not last long. The clicking of jaws returned, louder this time, echoing through the rocks like drums of war. Daniel turned his head quickly, gripping the branch tighter in his hand. From the shadows, more of the insect-like predators crawled out. Their red eyes glowed in the dim light, their black shells shining as if made of iron. They moved fast, their legs scraping against the ground, their claws leaving deep marks in the soil. The tiny aliens screamed, their high-pitched voices filling the valley. Mothers grabbed children, dragging them towards small stone shelters. Some of the elders pulled out tiny spears, no thicker than needles, but their trembling hands showed they knew those weapons would do nothing against the monsters. Daniel's heart pounded like a drum in his chest. He told himself he had already done enough, that this was not his fight. But as he looked at the crowd of tiny faces staring at him with fear and hope, something inside him refused to let go. He stepped forward, placing himself between the predators and the tiny people. His boots sank into the soft earth, his shadow falling across the frightened villagers. He lifted the branch, holding it like a sword, and shouted at the creatures, his voice booming through the valley. "Come on!" The first predator leapt, jaws wide, aiming for his chest. Daniel swung hard. The branch smashed into its shell, cracking it open with a sickening sound. The beast screeched, flipping over before collapsing. But two more rushed from the side. Daniel ducked as sharp claws sliced through the air above his head. He rolled on the ground, dirt sticking to his clothes, and struck upward, hitting another in the belly. The creature fell back, hissing angrily. The third one leapt onto his shoulder, biting down. Pain shot through Daniel's arm. He cried out, slamming his shoulder into a rock until the monster fell off. He kicked it away, his boot crushing its head. The tiny aliens watched with wide eyes, whispering in their strange language. Some of them pressed their hands together as if praying. The chief, standing at the front with his crown of crystal leaves, clenched his fists, torn between fear and hope. To them, Daniel looked like a towering warrior, a giant who had stepped into a fight no one else could win. But the predators were not finished. 5 more circled him, clicking their jaws, their legs moving in rhythm like trained hunters. Daniel breathed heavily, sweat running down his forehead. He adjusted his grip on the branch, his hands sore from the blows. The creatures darted in, one after another, testing him, trying to break his defense. Daniel swung again and again, each strike echoing like thunder in the valley. Wood slammed against shell, claws scraped against stone, and the ground shook under their fight. One predator managed to cut his leg with its sharp limb. Daniel groaned in pain, but did not fall. He stomped down with all his strength, the crunch of bone and shell vibrating through his boot. The beast shrieked before falling silent. The others hesitated, circling but keeping their distance. Daniel took a deep breath, raising the branch again, daring them to come closer. His arms trembled, but his eyes burned with determination. For a moment, time seemed frozen. The tiny aliens stood still, their glowing eyes fixed on him. The predators hissed and clicked, unsure if they should continue. Then, one of the smaller warriors among the aliens stepped forward, lifting his tiny spear high and shouting something in their language. The whole tribe cried out, their voices joining in a chant, giving Daniel strength. The sound rose into the air, filling the valley. Daniel roared, charging forward this time instead of waiting. He slammed the branch down, splitting another predator's back. He swung left, then right, smashing through shells, breaking legs, and sending the monsters tumbling across the dirt. His muscles screamed, his chest burned, but he refused to stop. Each time he thought he would collapse, he saw the tiny faces behind him, children holding their mothers, elders watching with tears in their eyes, the girl from before still standing at the front, her little hands clutching her chest. That was enough to keep him moving. Finally, the last predator gave a sharp hiss and stepped back. It clicked its jaws angrily, then turned and ran into the shadows. The others followed, dragging their broken bodies away, leaving behind silence once again. Daniel dropped the branch, his arms too weak to hold it anymore. His breathing was loud, his shirt torn, blood dripping from his arm and leg. He stood tall despite the pain, staring after the retreating monsters, making sure they were gone. The valley erupted in sound, but this time it was not screams. It was cheers, high-pitched but full of joy. The tiny aliens ran forward, gathering around him, their glowing eyes shining brighter than before. Some touched his boots with trembling hands, others bowed deeply. The chief stepped forward, tears shining in his eyes, and spoke words Daniel could not understand. But the meaning was clear: gratitude. The girl who had stood so bravely before the predators walked up slowly. She looked up at Daniel with a smile that was small but filled with light. Daniel knelt carefully, lowering himself so he didn't tower too much over them. He gave a tired smile, though his body ached all over. "You're safe now?" he whispered, even though they couldn't understand his words. The chief pointed toward their village, motioning for him to follow. The crowd parted, making a path. Daniel stood again, looking down at them. He had fought battles before, but never for people this small, never for lives so fragile. Yet somehow, this victory felt heavier, more important than any other. He had defended them, and now their eyes looked at him as if he was something more than human, something they desperately needed. Daniel followed the chief slowly, careful not to step on anyone. The tiny aliens moved around him like a flowing river, their glowing bodies guiding him through the valley. He tried to take light steps, but even the softest sound of his boots shook the ground for them. The tribe led him to their hidden village, and what he saw made his eyes widen. Their homes were carved into large stones and tree trunks, like miniature caves and towers glowing with moss light. Tiny bridges made of woven vines connected the homes high above, swinging gently as the small people crossed them. To Daniel, it looked like a city built for dolls, but it was alive, full of movement and sound. Children played with pebble-sized toys, elders sat weaving grass into ropes, and families cooked food on fires so small they were no higher than his knee. When the villagers noticed him, they froze. The entire place fell silent. Dozens of tiny glowing eyes turned toward the giant human standing at their gate. Mothers pulled children close, elders whispered in worried tones. Daniel could feel their fear, but also something else: curiosity. Some of the children were too young to be afraid. They giggled and ran closer, touching his boots, their small hands brushing against the rough leather. He smiled nervously, trying not to move too much in case he scared them. The chief raised his hand, speaking in a firm tone, calming the villagers. Slowly, the tension lessened, though their eyes stayed fixed on Daniel. The chief invited him to sit, pointing at a flat stone near the fire pit in the center of the village. Daniel carefully lowered himself down, his body towering over them even when he sat. The villagers brought out food, tiny fruits no bigger than his thumbnail, slices of roots, and drops of honey collected in carved shells. To them, it was a feast, but to Daniel, it looked like crumbs. Still, he smiled and picked up the food carefully between his fingers, placing it on his tongue. The taste was surprisingly sweet, almost like berries mixed with sugar. He nodded in approval, and the crowd let out soft murmurs of relief. Children gathered near him, watching every move he made. One little boy pointed at Daniel's hands, whispering in awe about how large they were. Another tugged at his bootlace, laughing when it moved like a giant snake. For the first time since arriving, Daniel chuckled. Their innocence warmed him, making him forget his bruises and wounds for a moment. But not everyone was pleased. A group of elders stood together, their eyes sharp and suspicious. One of them, with a long crystal staff, spoke loudly in their language. The words were unfamiliar, but Daniel could feel the meaning in the elder's tone. The man's face was tight with anger as he pointed toward Daniel, then mimed a crushing motion with his hands. The crowd grew quiet, fear spreading again. The elder was warning them. Giants destroy, giants take, giants do not protect. Daniel's chest tightened. He could not argue with words because they did not understand his language. Instead, he placed a hand over his chest and shook his head slowly. Then he spread his arms wide, palms open, showing he carried no weapons. He bent his head low, lowering himself until his forehead nearly touched the ground before them. The The tiny villagers gasped in surprise. A giant bowing to them was something they had never seen. The elder frowned, unsure what to say. The chief stepped forward, placing his hand firmly on the elder's shoulder, shaking his head. The elder turned away reluctantly, muttering under his breath. The fire burned low as the night deepened. Daniel sat quietly, watching their world unfold. He saw them repairing broken fences, tending to children, and whispering stories under the light of the moss. Their lives were fragile, but also beautiful. Every movement was careful, every tool crafted with patience. He realized then how dangerous the predators truly were for them. A single attack could destroy half the village in seconds. Without someone strong to fight for them, their entire people could vanish. The chief climbed onto a small rock to stand taller. He looked at Daniel and then spoke loudly, his voice echoing through the village. The villagers listened in silence. Though Daniel did not understand the words, he understood the weight behind them. The chief was explaining something important. His hand pointed toward Daniel, then toward the stars above. Some villagers nodded, others shook their heads. The debate was fierce, but it ended with the chief slamming his staff against the stone floor, making a sharp sound that silenced everyone. The chief turned toward Daniel with eyes full of decision. He walked closer, his crown of crystal leaves shining in the firelight, and touched Daniel's boot gently. Then he raised both hands as if presenting him to the people. The villagers bowed their heads, some reluctantly, some with genuine respect. Daniel realized what had happened. The chief had declared him part of their village, their protector. Daniel sat back, staring at the tiny faces lit by the fire. He never planned for this. He had come for minerals, for work, not for responsibility. Yet now an entire people were looking at him as their shield against the darkness. He could see it in their eyes, the hope, the fear, the desperate trust. The small girl from before stood at the edge of the crowd, her bright eyes fixed on him, a faint smile on her lips. Daniel's chest grew heavy. He felt both honored and trapped at the same time. The night grew colder, and Daniel stretched out near the fire. The flames barely warmed him, but it was enough for the little ones who sat close by. He lay on his back, staring up at the stars, his mind spinning. He thought about the predators, about the elder's warnings, about the way the chief had looked at him. He knew one thing for certain: the fight earlier had only been the beginning. The predators would return, and when they did, he would have to stand again. The villagers now believed he was their protector. He could not fail them, no matter the cost. At dawn, the first rays of sunlight touched the valley, turning the moss roofs and crystal leaves into glowing gold. Daniel woke slowly, his body sore from the battle the night before. Every muscle in his arms ached, and the scratches on his skin burned. But what bothered him more was the memory of the way the tiny people had looked at him. They had placed their trust in him, a stranger, without even knowing who he really was. He sat up, rubbing his eyes, and noticed that the village was not calm like the night before. Drums were echoing across the valley, steady and deep, filling the air with tension. The tiny villagers gathered in the center, their glowing eyes wide with both excitement and fear. Daniel stood and watched, unsure of what was happening. The chief, wearing his crown of crystal leaves, climbed onto a stone platform that served as their stage. His staff struck the ground, and the crowd fell silent. The chief began to speak in a loud, commanding voice, his hands moving with great energy. Though Daniel could not understand the words, he understood the mood. The chief was about to make an important decision, one that would affect the entire village. The tiny people nodded, some whispering in agreement, while others shook their heads and argued quietly. The tension grew heavier with every word. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, wishing he could understand. Then he noticed how often the chief's hand pointed toward him. The villagers turned their eyes to Daniel again and again, as though the speech was about him. His stomach tightened. He had already saved them once? Did they expect him to stay forever? He took a step back, but the villagers only stared harder. Finally, the chief raised his staff high and shouted something that made the crowd gasp. A ripple of shock spread through the tiny people. Some cheered. Some covered their mouths. Others argued loudly. Daniel looked around in confusion. He didn't know what had been said, but it was clear the chief had made a decision that shook everyone. The chief lifted his arms again and called someone forward. From behind the crowd, a small figure stepped out. It was a girl, no taller than Daniel's hand. She walked slowly, dressed in a delicate garment woven from silk threads that shimmered in the sunlight. Her hair was decorated with flowers, and her glowing eyes were lowered shyly. The crowd parted for her, bowing their heads as she passed. Daniel blinked in surprise, realizing this was not just any villager. She was someone important. The chief's voice grew softer but firm as he spoke again, his hand resting on the girl's shoulder. Then he pointed at Daniel. The villagers began to chant, their voices high and full of emotion. The girl lifted her head and looked directly at Daniel, her expression filled with nervous courage. Daniel's chest tightened. Something was wrong. He didn't understand, but he felt the weight of what was happening. The chief finally spoke the words that Daniel feared were meant for him. The girl stepped closer, bowing deeply, her tiny hands holding a crown made of flower petals. She whispered something in her language, her voice trembling but steady. Daniel looked around at the villagers, hoping someone would explain. But their eyes told him enough. The meaning was clear, even without words. By their tradition, he was no longer just a protector. He was now bound to them as family. And more than that, he was being given a wife. Daniel froze, his mouth slightly open in shock. His heart thumped hard against his ribs. He almost laughed, thinking it must be some mistake. But the villagers weren't joking. Their faces were serious, expectant. They truly believed this was the way to keep him loyal. The chief had decided that the only way to secure the bond between the giant and the tribe was through marriage. And the bride was standing before him now, trembling but waiting. Daniel rubbed his forehead, trying to understand. How could this be real? She was so small, so delicate, her entire body light enough to sit on his palm. He thought about refusing, about shaking his head and walking away. But then he saw the fear in the villagers' eyes. To them, this was not a joke. It was a sacred act. If he refused, it would mean rejecting their trust, maybe even insulting their entire people. His refusal might break everything he had fought for. The villagers began to cheer again, clapping their tiny hands, their voices filling the valley with chants. The girl stepped closer, holding out the flower crown with both hands. Daniel looked into her eyes. She was nervous. Yes, but there was also pride in her gaze. She was not being forced against her will. She was following her people's tradition, ready to sacrifice her own freedom to ensure her tribe's survival. That realization hit Daniel hard. She was just as brave as when she had stood in front of the predators. He knelt slowly, lowering himself so he would not tower over her too much. The crowd fell silent, waiting for his response. Daniel hesitated, his heart racing, his mind filled with questions. He had never expected this, never imagined that defending them would lead to such a strange bond. He did not know what kind of life this would create, what responsibilities it would bring. But when he looked at the villagers, when he saw their hope and desperation, he understood something. To them, this was not just about marriage. It was about survival. The chief raised his staff once more, shouting words that echoed across the valley. The people cheered louder than before, dancing in circles, throwing petals into the air. The girl placed the flower crown at Daniel's feet, her glowing eyes never leaving his face. Daniel stared at it, stunned, unable to decide if he should laugh, cry, or run. But one thing was certain. His life had just changed in ways he never thought possible. He had come to this planet searching for minerals, but now he had been given something else entirely. A role he had never asked for, a wife he had never imagined, and a bond with a people who believed he was their only hope. The girl stood before Daniel, her hands shaking slightly as she held the crown of petals. Her name was Lyra, and the chief proudly announced it to his people. The crowd repeated her name in unison, their voices rising like a chant. Daniel's throat went dry as he looked at her. She was delicate, smaller than his hand, yet her eyes carried both fear and strength. She bowed her head and said something softly, her voice like the whisper of a bell. Though he could not understand her words, the meaning seemed clear. She was offering herself to him, accepting the role her people had given her. Daniel wanted to protest. He wanted to tell them that this was not right, that he could not be her husband. But when he opened his mouth, no words came. Every face in the village was turned toward him, filled with expectation. They were not laughing. not mocking. To them, this was sacred. If he rejected her, he would not only hurt Lyra, but insult the entire tribe. His refusal could break the fragile trust that had formed between him and these people. His heart pounded harder, and for the first time, Daniel felt truly trapped. The chief raised his arms, his voice booming in their tiny language. The villagers cheered again, throwing petals into the air, tiny bits of color floating down like confetti. Lyra stepped forward, her small hands trembling as she placed the crown at Daniel's feet. Then she lifted her glowing eyes to him and whispered again. Daniel bent lower, his ear close to her voice. This time he caught a single word that was repeated with clear meaning. Yours. Daniel's chest tightened. He shook his head quickly, whispering back, No, you don't understand. I can't. But his words were useless. She didn't understand his language. The only thing she saw was a giant hesitating to accept her. She pressed her lips together, standing straighter, her small shoulders lifting with determination. She repeated the word, louder this time. Yours. The crowd erupted with cheers, clapping their small hands in rhythm. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, struggling inside. He had never felt so powerless. He wanted to scream that he was not their savior, that he never asked for this. But when he opened his eyes again, he saw the faces of the children, smiling and clapping, the elders watching with cautious hope, and the chief looking at him with pride. And then his eyes fell on Lyra again. She was trembling. Yes, but her gaze was steady. She was not afraid of him. She was trusting him. Slowly, Daniel reached out his hand, careful not to scare her. Lyra looked at his fingers, then stepped onto his palm with delicate steps. The crowd gasped in awe as the giant lifted their new mini-wife into the air. Lyra stood tall in his hand, her dress of silk threads shining in the sunlight, her flower crown glowing against her hair. She lifted her tiny hand high as if declaring to her people that she was ready. The villagers cheered louder, their voices echoing through the valley. Daniel forced a weak smile, though his heart was heavy with confusion. As the celebration continued, the tribe decorated Lyra with more glowing gems and silk ribbons. Tiny maidens brushed her hair, while others painted small designs on her arms with berry juice. She looked like a princess from a fairy tale, though her kingdom was no bigger than Daniel's boot. The villagers danced, beating small drums and singing high-pitched songs. Daniel sat silently, trying to process everything. He kept glancing at Lyra, who now sat proudly on a small throne made of wood and flowers. Her eyes, however, often turned toward him, studying his face as though trying to understand what kind of man fate had tied her to. Later, as the sun set and the music faded, Lyra was brought to Daniel again. She climbed carefully onto his shoulder this time, her tiny hand resting against his neck for balance. She leaned close and whispered, her voice filled with emotion. Though Daniel could not understand her words, he felt the weight of her tone. She was sharing her people's fears. He caught the name of the predators repeated several times, followed by a trembling pause. Her voice shook slightly, but her eyes glowed with hope as she looked at him. She believed he could protect them again. Daniel swallowed hard. He wanted to tell her that he didn't know if he could. He wanted to say that he was just a man, not a god, not a savior. But when he looked into her eyes, he couldn't bring himself to speak. She trusted him too much. Breaking that trust felt impossible. Instead, he gave a small nod. Lyra's face softened into a faint smile, and she leaned her head against his neck for a brief moment. It was a gesture so simple, yet it made Daniel's chest ache in ways he didn't understand. Around them, the villagers whispered excitedly. They believed the bond was sealed. The protector now had a wife, the daughter of their chief, and with it, their tribe's future felt secure. They lit fires around the village, the flames glowing like stars against the darkening sky. The chief stood tall, watching with solemn eyes. He had tied his daughter's fate to a stranger, a giant, but in his heart, he believed it was the only way to ensure their survival. Daniel lay down that night, staring at the stars again. Lyra curled up on a small patch of soft moss near his shoulder, her breathing steady as she fell asleep. He listened to the quiet rhythm of her tiny breaths, feeling the strange weight of responsibility settle deeper into his bones. He had not come here looking for family or love. Yet here he was, bound to a people who saw him as their only hope, with a tiny wife who had placed her trust in him completely. He closed his eyes slowly, knowing that from this moment forward, his life would never be the same. The calm nights in the valley lasted only a short while. For a few days, Daniel tried to live among the tiny people, learning their ways, sharing food, and watching how they rebuilt their broken fences after the predator attack. Lyra often sat on his shoulder, guiding him through their customs, pointing at things, and teaching him words in her language. The bond between them grew stronger, even if Daniel still felt strange about being called her husband. But deep inside, he knew peace could not last forever. One evening, while Daniel helped lift heavy stones to repair a wall, a group of tiny scouts rushed into the village. Their faces were pale, their voices trembling as they shouted words that even Daniel, without knowing the language, could understand. The tone was clear. Danger was coming. The villagers froze, their tiny glowing eyes wide with fear. The chief banged his staff against the ground, demanding silence, then listened to the scouts. The word predators came again and again, mixed with frantic hand gestures pointing toward the forest. Daniel's stomach sank. He had expected this, but the dread still hit him hard. He looked at Lyra, who was standing close, her hands clutching the edge of his shirt. Her eyes were full of fear, but she did not cry. She whispered to him, repeating the word for predators again, then touched his chest gently, as if asking if he was ready. Daniel took a deep breath, his heart pounding. He gave her a small nod, though deep inside he wondered if he truly could protect them this time. The sky turned darker as the sound of clicking jaws grew closer. It started faint, like raindrops on stone, but soon it became a thunderous chorus. The ground shook with every step of the approaching beasts. Daniel grabbed the same branch he had used before, though it was already splintered from the last fight. He wished he had real weapons, something made of steel, but this was all he had. He tightened his grip until his knuckles turned white. The villagers hurried underground, vanishing into hidden tunnels beneath their homes. Mothers carried children in leaf baskets. Elders leaned on canes as younger warriors guided them below. Still, many stayed above, refusing to abandon Daniel and the chief. They lined the edges of the village with their tiny spears, though they knew their weapons were useless. The chief stood tall on his platform, his eyes fixed on the forest. His voice was steady as he commanded his people, but Daniel noticed the slight tremble in his hands. Even their leader was afraid. The first predator burst into the valley, bigger than the ones Daniel had fought before. Its shell was thicker, its jaws sharper, and its red eyes glowed brighter in the night. Behind it came more, at least a dozen, moving in unison, their clicking legs digging deep into the soil. The sound was deafening, like drums of war. The villagers gasped in terror, clutching each other tightly. Lyra gripped Daniel's sleeve, her tiny body shaking. Daniel gently lifted her and placed her on his shoulder, whispering, "Stay close." The monsters spread out, surrounding the village. Their shadows loomed over the tiny homes, and their hissing filled the air. Daniel stood in the center, his branch raised, his body tense. He felt sweat drip down his neck, his breathing quick and shallow. For a moment, he wondered if this was the end. He was just one man with a stick facing an army of predators. But then he looked at the villagers peeking from their tunnels, their glowing eyes fixed on him. He thought of the trust they had placed in him, of Lyra's small voice whispering, "Yours." He could not run. The first beast charged, its legs slicing through the dirt. Daniel swung with all his strength, smashing its side. The branch cracked loudly, pieces flying off, but the creature staggered back with a screech. Another rushed from the left, claws slashing. Daniel ducked, rolling to the side, and hit its legs. It stumbled but quickly recovered. They were faster, stronger this time, and smarter too. They attacked in groups, circling him, testing his defenses. Daniel fought desperately, swinging left, then right, kicking one beast down and crushing another under his boot. But for every one he struck, another appeared. His arms burned, his lungs screamed for air. Blood trickled down his arm, where a claw had cut deep, staining his torn shirt. He groaned, but forced himself to keep moving. He had no choice. The villagers screamed from their tunnels, chanting words to encourage him. Tiny warriors shot arrows tipped with poison, though they barely scratched the shells of the predators. Still, their bravery gave Daniel strength. He roared, slamming the branch down on another beast, splitting its head. The ground shook with the impact, dust rising into the air. But the predators didn't stop. More crawled into the valley, their numbers growing. Daniel's heart sank as he realized there were too many. His branch cracked in half after one heavy blow, leaving him with only a jagged stick. He looked at it in despair, then clenched his teeth and used it anyway, stabbing and smashing with whatever strength he had left. The chief shouted orders, his voice strong despite the fear in his eyes. Lyra clung to Daniel's shoulder, shouting her own words, her small voice fierce. She called to her people, urging them not to give up. Her courage spread like fire. Tiny warriors rushed out, throwing burning moss at the predators. Flames lit the valley, making the beasts shriek and stumble. Daniel seized the chance, grabbing rocks and hurling them with all his might. Each stone hit with crushing force, breaking shells and scattering the monsters. Still, Daniel knew this battle was different. This was not just a fight for survival, it was a war for the tribe's future. If he failed now, the entire village would vanish. He clenched his jaw, ignoring the pain, and pressed forward again. Each swing, each kick, each stone he threw carried the weight of an entire people's hope. The valley roared with chaos, monsters hissing, fire crackling, villagers chanting. Daniel stood at the center, bloodied, exhausted, but unbroken. He could not fall. Not while they still believed in him. Not while Lyra's small hands clung to him, trusting him with her life. The night was far from over, but Daniel swore silently to himself that no matter how many predators came, he would fight until the last breath left his body. The valley burned with light and sound. Daniel's arms ached, his lungs felt like fire, and blood dripped down his wounds, but he did not stop. He stood in the middle of the chaos, swinging the broken branch and throwing stones with everything he had. Each strike shook the ground, each roar echoed like thunder. The predators hissed, their red eyes glowing with rage, but they could not bring him down. The tiny villagers fought beside him, their voices rising high in chants that carried through the smoke. Children hid deep in tunnels, but their small cries of encouragement drifted up to him. The warriors, no bigger than his hand, ran out bravely with their spears and burning moss. Though their weapons were weak, their courage was strong, and that strength gave Daniel more power than he thought possible. One of the largest predators leapt at him, its claws shining in the firelight. Daniel grabbed it by the leg, straining with all his strength, and swung it hard against the rocks. The crack of shell against stone sent the beast screeching before it collapsed. He roared in answer, his voice shaking the valley. For a moment, even the monsters seemed to hesitate, but the fight dragged on. The creatures were many, and Daniel's body grew weaker with each minute. His shirt was ripped, his skin cut and bruised, but he still stood tall. His eyes burned with determination. He thought of the faces behind him, the glowing eyes of the villagers who had placed their hope on him. He thought of Lyra, clinging to him, shouting courage with her tiny voice. He could not fall. The chief raised his staff high, calling to his people. Warriors with small bows fired poisoned arrows, aiming at the softer joints of the predators. Some of the creatures hissed and stumbled as the poison spread. Others screeched as fire caught on their legs, the burning moss thrown by villagers sticking to their shells. Daniel used every chance he got, slamming rocks and crushing the beasts one by one. The battle raged until the valley floor was covered with broken shells, blood, and smoke. Finally, the remaining predators shrieked, their bodies shaking in fear. They turned away, crawling back into the shadows of the forest, leaving their dead behind. The valley fell silent, except for the heavy sound of Daniel's breathing. His arms dropped, the broken branch falling from his hand. He staggered slightly but stayed on his feet. The silence lasted only a moment before it broke into cheers. The villagers poured out of the tunnels, their tiny hands lifted in joy, their glowing eyes filled with tears. They surrounded Daniel, shouting his name in their high-pitched voices. Their words were strange, but he understood the meaning. They were alive, and they were thanking him. Daniel sank to his knees, his body trembling with exhaustion. He looked around at the faces of the people he had fought for, and his heart filled with something he had not felt in a long time: belonging. He had come to this world as an outsider, a stranger searching for minerals, but now he was more than that. He was their protector, their giant, their hero. The chief stepped forward, his crown of crystal leaves glowing in the firelight. He bowed deeply, lowering his head until it touched the ground. The other villagers followed, bowing together. Daniel felt overwhelmed, not knowing how to respond. Then he felt a small weight on his shoulder. Lyra climbed up carefully, her tiny hands gripping his torn shirt. She looked at him with eyes that glowed not with fear, but with pride. She smiled softly, whispering words he could not understand, but he felt their meaning in her tone. She was proud of him. She believed in him. She claimed him as hers, not just because of tradition, but because of the bond that had grown between them through fire and battle. Daniel gently lifted her into his hand, holding her close. For the first time, he smiled fully, despite his pain. The villagers danced around the fire, their songs rising into the night sky. They sang of victory, of survival, of their giant protector who had stood against the darkness. Children laughed again, safe in their mother's arms. Warriors stood tall, though their weapons were small, proud to have fought beside the human. The chief raised his staff, declaring loudly that the giant was no longer a stranger. He was one of them now. Daniel sat quietly, holding Lyra, watching their joy. He realized that this world had given him something he had not expected. He had come for resources, for work, but he had found a new purpose. These people had tied him to their fate, and now he accepted it. He would not walk away. He would protect them, fight for them, and live among them. The night stretched on with songs and celebration, but in Daniel's mind, he could still hear the echoes of battle. He knew the predators would return someday. There would be more fights, more dangers. But he also knew he would never face them alone. The tribe stood with him, and he stood with them. Together, giant and small, they had proven that courage did not depend on size. Lyra curled against his chest, her tiny hands resting on his shirt as she drifted to sleep. Daniel leaned back, staring up at the stars. The sky was wide and endless, but for the first time he felt grounded. He was not just a wanderer anymore. He was part of a story, part of a family, part of a people who had claimed him as their own. The valley was safe for now. The fires burned warmly, the songs filled the night, and Daniel closed his eyes with a tired but peaceful smile. He had come as a stranger, but now he was their protector, their legend, and in their hearts, forever one of them.